Hi everyone, and thank you for attending ISSOTL 2021. Today we have Authenti from the National University of Singapore, who will introduce his fellow speaker by conducting a workshop, and they will be conducting a workshop titled Scenario-Based Student-Generated Questions for Students to Develop an Attempt for Authentic Assessments. This workshop is an hour session, and the timer will go off 5 minutes before the end of session, just as a heads up. And please consider keeping your videos off and keeping yourselves on mute while the speakers are speaking, and unless you guys are asking a question. Yeah, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shamima, for the very kind introduction. And again, thank you very much to the attendees who have graced your presence in this presentation that Mavian and myself have prepared. Okay, at any point of time, if you do have questions, please do feel free to type them in the chat box. So on my side, so we did a dry run earlier, we meaning Mavian and I. So as I present, I'll not be able to have visibility on the questions in the chat, and that is where Mavian would just highlight to me whether there are questions, and I'll stop, take a pause, and answer the questions that you have. Okay, so we really envision this to be a dialogue where, at any point of time, if you do have questions, just feel free to either raise your hand, which I understand you can do in this Canopy platform, or type your questions in the chat. So with that, I would really like to begin by sharing with all of you the personal journey, okay, that I've encountered, and it was quite interesting. As I was preparing my slides, if you attended the keynote speech that we had today, he also talked about a personal story on how he was involved in the sustainability arena. Okay, so likewise, I'm going to use a story of my experience in how I've so-called helped with my students learning what were the problems and how the use of scenario-based student-generated questions have helped with the students' learning. So with that, there are 5 points that I really want to share with you, and these 4 points specifically would be where the activity comes in, okay? And that's where we will work with you on how you could also develop your own sbsgq. So let's look at the first part here. Well, what is the problem? Again, I guess by now you would have a sense what the problem is, and that is really, there are some students who, although, despite scaffolding, despite having peer learning, there's still a lack of mastery by these students. Let me explain more in this next slide. So what we did here in the modules was to engage this step framework, okay, which consists of the 4 items here: student engagement, teaching to clarify concepts, early and timely feedback, and peer learning. Okay, and this step framework is heavily inspired from these references by Biggs, King, and Schulman. Now, what we found was that before the step framework was implemented, we do have a group of students, okay, that fail to understand the learning objectives that were taught. However, after the STEP framework was implemented, more students understood the concepts, but we still had a handful of students who did not understand. And these students would, okay, as you can see, this is a screenshot of my inbox, okay, they would send their questions, okay, and they send them in the volumes, okay. Because I teach large classes, it is not uncommon, or in other words, it is quite common to receive this volume of questions from students. And so I thought, okay, the STEP framework has helped reduce this region over here, from this portion to this over here. But how do I minimize this portion even further, while at the same time provide the students who understand a more meaningful educational experience? Okay, so that is where we go to the next part of this talk, and that is really the solution. Okay, and the solution that's proposed is SB, which stands for scenario-based SGQ, student-generated questions. Okay, now the usual process, okay, that we see in a classroom would be the teacher, represented by these orange boxes. Okay, the teacher would identify the LOs, or the learning objectives, develop the questions around the learning objectives. Subsequently, the teacher would then formulate the answers to the questions, present the questions to assess the student's understanding, and then finally, that's where the student will come in to attempt the questions. But the proposed process is, why don't we engage the students in more boxes instead of the last one over here. For example, why don't we engage the students in developing the questions? Why don't we engage the students in formulating the answers, presenting the questions and the answers, and finally, attempt the questions developed by their peers? So you can see that as we engage the student in this process, you can see that there's an element of active learning. They no longer become recipients, but they become involved stakeholders in this whole process. Okay, and the mode that we're going to use is the student-generated question. There's this reference over here, which is a very nice piece of literature that I really encourage those interested to read on. But in essence, the premise, okay, of the SGQ is that the students can only generate a meaningful question if they have understood the content. If they do not understand the content fully, they will still be able to generate the question, but that question will have flaws. But these flaws are actually indicators by which the facilitator can provide targeted constructive feedback. Because after all, if we do not know which areas the students are struggling with, it's really very hard for us to help the students. And that is why when we know which areas the students are struggling with, then we can identify these areas through the flaws in their question. And from there, provide targeted feedback. And if you take a step back and look at the whole process, it really encourages active learning and students to take ownership. And it was quite interesting that when we did a focus group, okay, to these students, we hear from some of the students that they were so invested in the questions that they really take ownership, and they were very proud when they presented the questions to their peers. Okay, so it really enhances this point that students are able to have that sense of ownership in all of this. And then this part, I think, is quite important. We want our assessments to be authentic. Okay, so for example, we want our questions, or we want the questions that the students develop to reflect actual examples from the industry, okay, or to reflect real life scenarios that we see in the newspapers, in, let's say, developments in the industry and so on. So with this in mind, i.e., our assessments being authentic, we transform the SGQ, which you have seen in the previous slide, which is this slide. I've repeated the slide over here for simple recap. We've transformed this process into the sbsgq bracket A. Now that's quite a mouthful, yeah. But in essence, what it does is that it adds several additional features from the slide that you see previously. What are these features? These features are highlighted in orange. For example, we want students to engage the higher orders of Bloom's taxonomy. In other words, we tell the students that, okay, in your question generation, try to avoid simple recall questions. Like, for example, what are the basic so-called requirements for photosynthesis? Okay, instead of a simple recall type of question, we want students to go into the higher orders, application, synthesis type of questions. So that's one change that we implemented. The other change that we implemented or incorporated is the use of real-world similar examples. In other words, we tell the students, when you generate the question, try to formulate your question around actual incidents that we see in the world. Okay, hence this SB over here, the scenario-based component. Okay, then finally, we say, okay, once you've developed the question, try to develop the answer to your question. And hence, we have the A over here. And if you take a step back and really look at it, it builds upon literature which proposed this structure. And if you think about it, a student can only generate a meaningful question and accurate answers if they understood the content perfectly or close to perfection. Okay, and this was something that we were quite excited about, and we tried to implement this in 2 modules. Okay, during the time of COVID, which is the online learning environment. So again, to reiterate, we pushed boundaries through the addition of these 2, which is the development of the answer to the question and the use of real-world examples to develop the questions. So the implementation, okay, how did we do it? Okay, a typical semester, okay, in our university takes about 13 weeks. So in weeks 3 to 4, students were introduced to the Bloom's taxonomy. So in that sense, they would know what constitutes a lower order question, what constitutes a higher order question. So we thought it was good to have this grounding before we ask students to develop the question. Now, we also understand that students may be new to this whole process, because if you think about it, students have always been the recipients of questions rather than the authors of questions. Hence, in week 6, there is an ungraded submission again to allow students to get to know the ropes of the whole process. Then, in recess week, which is the week after week 6, I will provide feedback to the students based on their first draft. And in the subsequent weeks, which is week 7 and 8, after recess, that's where students will teach their peers. Now, we found this component to be extremely helpful because this is where students from other groups who have also developed their own questions are able to learn from the questions that their peers have developed, and from there, improve their questions. And if you take a step back and look at this whole process, the quality of questions that were developed generally increased. So what we have employed in this implementation process is really a scaffolding process for students to familiarize with the process and also to be accustomed to the skills required in student generation, and also the effect of peer learning as well. Okay, then finally there is the graded submission. So now I've talked about the problem and the solution. Let's look at some examples of the students' work. There were several so-called evidences, but I thought I'll just maybe show one or two. But if let's say if you're interested, I can try to dig up more and show in this session. But again, it really depends on the time and also the number of questions that we have. So let's go into the third part, the students' work. Now this is an example, an excerpt from the students that submitted, and here you can see that they utilized an actual so-called industry example. Of course, names were so-called replaced with anonymous names so as not to identify certain companies. But you can see that there is the context over here, and the context is you have a construction firm, and this firm has a 2-story manufacturing factory. And during the annual general meeting, the leadership, specifically the CEO, is concerned with the high operating expense from the energy consumption, or specifically the electrical consumption. Students are then provided the figures, which is the electrical consumption is calculated to be this amount, but they want to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So we are now an energy specialist, and we want to help them conduct an energy audit to reduce their energy usage and greenhouse gas emissions. So this is where the students have used an actual example to constitute that scenario from which the learning objectives will be assessed via the questions. Now, in the next slide, I'll show you the questions that were asked, and that is the questions that the students came up with, right? Identify an example under each scope of greenhouse gas emissions, So typically there are 3 scopes in the greenhouse gas emissions, and they even provided the answers, right? So these answers are hidden when they present these questions to their peers. And once their peers have answered, then this is where the answers will be discussed. So we have one question over here, and this employs the higher orders of Bloom taxonomy because they need to apply what they have learned in the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 lecture to this specific context that is given to them. And this specific context is based on actual industry examples. And it's not just that, we also have an example over here, a part B question where calculation is involved. So for example, are students able to apply this formula in the context that the students have developed? And what really impressed me and really encouraged me was that the students went beyond the course material. And again, this goes to show the ownership that they had in this sbsgq that they've developed. They went beyond the course material and looked up at additional sources. So just to share with you, this figure was not taught during the lecture. Hence, when I saw that students were able to source for materials beyond the lecture materials, it was really encouraging because it goes to show that they are able to synthesize, right, what they have learned in lecture with other relevant concepts beyond the lecture. And from there, provide the question, which basically in this case asks for the optimal tilt angle and direction for the solar panels in Phoenix, Arizona. And they've given an answer as well based on this figure. So the results, from the sbsgq was quite promising. Now, this WSGQ represents the cohort with the SGQ intervention. EM represents the module, energy management module. Now, WO represents without the intervention for the same module. Now, if we take a look at the higher grades, okay, we can see that there's a higher percentage of students that were in this category when there is the intervention as compared to the cohort without the intervention. Now, the reverse is also true. When we look at the lower grades, okay, this category, there's a lower proportion of students in the intervention cohort, but a higher proportion of students in the cohort without the intervention. Then, one of the concerns that we had when we developed an intervention to really help with scholarly teaching and learning is that it may only be applicable to a certain context. Okay, that's what we hear from our peers when we discuss. They often say that, the intervention that you develop is only applicable to your module. It may not be applicable to my module because of the differences in the learning objectives and so on. And that is why when we developed this study, we implemented the SBSGQs in two modules, energy management and research methods. And what was interesting was that generally, you see the same trend as well. With the SGQ, you do see a higher proportion of students in the higher letter grades. Okay, and the reverse is also true. With the intervention, you see a lower proportion of students in the lower letter grades. Okay, now there's going to be a talk, okay, on the 28th of October, where I'll share more about the results and also the feedback from the students, okay, on this SBSGQ intervention. But because this is the workshop, we'll move to the next part, okay, and that is the practice. Okay, so timing wise, we are doing quite well. It's now 10 a.m. on my side, which means that we have about 40 minutes for this activity. And really, the aim of this workshop is to provide you with the exposure of the SBSGQ and to provide you with some time to see how do you think the SBSGQ could be implemented in your own modules for your own learning objectives. Okay, but before we go into the activity itself, let me give you some, I guess, guidance. So at least this could help you with the activity. In the development of the SBSGQ, there are several things that we took note of. For example, the amount of guidance. How much guidance do we want to provide the students? Okay, in this case, I've just basically replicated the table that was shown earlier to enable an easy cross comparison. So in this case, the guidance there were several stages of guidance provided over here. First, I told there was a tutorial where students were introduced to Bloom's taxonomy. If you want, you could leave these to self-reading by the students. Okay, but then again, it really depends on the curriculum structure that you have for the modules and how much time or let's say contact hours that you have with the students as well. Okay, the other form of guidance that was provided is the submission of the first draft and the feedback based on the first draft. Okay, so this is the mode of guidance that was used in this study. Next, peer learning. Okay, we found it very helpful, okay, for students to teach their peers on the improved draft. But then again, if let's say your timetable does not allow, we may even do this online. So again, it really depends how you want to structure that peer learning element. It could be an asynchronous mode, okay, if time doesn't allow. Next, tutorials. Okay, do we want to incorporate all of these features in tutorials or during lectures? Pros and cons. In tutorials, it's much, we have a smaller class and that enables a closer interaction and more targeted feedback in that sense. Because when you teach to a larger group of students in lectures, it can be quite challenging, right? Because a question asked by a particular student may not apply to the rest of the student. Okay, so this is another thing to consider. Mark allocation. Now, this one was, I won't say that it's the most important, but it is quite a significant, factor. Let me explain. In our study, the mark allocated for the SGQ was, if I recall, was 10%. Okay, most studies in literature, I think they allocate either 3 or 5%. Okay, and again, students being students, they would invest in assessments that have a higher weightage towards their final grade. So this is another lever that lecturers can also use or fine-tune to control that amount of engagement, okay, that they would want students to invest in this assignment. Okay, so these are some considerations. Next, I have additional questions, and if you want, you can take a screenshot of this slide. You can save it in your PowerPoint or maybe in Paint, and you can refer through this later on in your activity. As lecturers, okay, we will wear two hats. So the first three questions would really be from the point of view of the lecturer, and the last point would be from the point of view of the student. Okay, in the activity later, from the lecturer's point of view, we can ask ourselves, which level of Bloom's taxonomy do we want our students to engage in? Okay, because in some modules, the recall component is very important. For example, I have colleagues in pharmacy, the Department of Pharmacy. The recall component is very important. Why? Because if someone comes to them and say, okay, I need a certain drug to treat these symptoms, they will need to be able to recall what kind of drugs would treat this kind of symptoms, right? So in that context, the recall part is important. But if, let's say, your learning objectives rely heavily on the synthesis and the application part, then that is where the higher orders of Bloom's taxonomy will be more appropriate. So that's the first question. Which level of the Bloom's taxonomy do you think would be appropriate for your module? After you have answered that question, from the lecturer's point of view, do you want the sbsgq to be an individual or group assignment? Now, because I teach large classes, it's about 150, again, depending on the cohorts, 150 students. I ask students to prepare one sbsgq, and that one sbsgq can have several parts like 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, and so on. Okay, one sbsgq in groups of 4 to 5. Okay, because it will be quite challenging if all 150 students were to prepare one and have to give individual feedback, during recess and so on. So I thought a nice balance would be a group assignment. But then again, some of us in this workshop may be teaching small classes, and in that sense, you may have the flexibility to explore individual level sbsgq. Okay, so this is another thing that I'd like to highlight, and that is the flexibility of this sbsgq. It can be tailored for large classes and small classes, okay, to provide our students with the authentic assessment and engaging learning experience. So this is the second question. Do you want it to be an individual or a group assignment? Now, the third question is, which industry or real-life examples would be relevant to the context? And again, it is no surprise that this really depends on the discipline, okay, or the modules that are being taught. Then finally, after wearing the hats of the lecturer for the first three questions, let us now wear the hat of the student sitting in our classes. As a student, okay, I've not sat for your class before, or at least hopefully not, hopefully it's not a repeat. I've not sat in your class before, okay, and I'm now tasked by the lecturer to develop one sbsgq based on several learning objectives, okay. But in this case, for the purpose of this activity, you may just identify one learning objective and try to put yourself in the shoes of the student to see how he or she would develop the sbsgq. Now, in this talk, we have uploaded an attachment in Canopy, and you can access that. So if you go to the agenda, if you click on our talk, before you click the join button, there are some links at the bottom. So there's an attachment over there, and that attachment is actually the infographic that Navian and I have prepared, okay, to aid with this activity. So you can download that PDF, and with that PDF and with this screenshot, okay, please proceed to the activity itself. Now, one example, okay, that I thought would be helpful to show you, okay, to again, maybe to help those who may still have difficulty with understanding this concept, okay. So I thought I prepared one example, which is this one, yeah. So in this case, the teacher was trying to teach students about the three phases of matter, okay, a gas, solid, and liquid, and how they interact with each other. And so one question, the one possible first draft by the teacher students is as seen in the screen. So for example, the student may ask their peers, which of the following setup would have the ice cube melt the fastest? Okay, so you have air at 22 or 27, 32 or 37. Okay, so the only difference, or in this case, the only variable would be the temperature of the air. Okay, and experience would tell us that the option 4 over here would have the ice cube melt the fastest. But the teacher then provides feedback, right? So this is the first draft, but the teacher realizes that only two phases were involved. The gaseous state, which is your air, the solid state, which is the ice cube, was involved. But this student failed to incorporate the liquid state. So the teacher comes in and tells the student, can you maybe fine tune your sbsgq to incorporate the liquid state? And so the student comes back and say, okay, I've now minimized the difference in temperature from 22, 27, 32, 37 to just 22, 27, 22, 27. But what I have done now, I meaning the student, is to incorporate this liquid phase. Okay. Then the teacher looks at this question and say, okay, that looks a bit better because it does address the learning objective, right? Which is to understand the interactions between the gaseous, solid, and the liquid phase. And then the teacher at this point says, okay, you may want to, maybe add the numbers, okay, because otherwise students attempting your question will not know which option to indicate in the answer sheet. So this is just a hypothetical case by which we could envision how the interaction between the student and the teacher takes shape, okay, through the use of the sbsgq. Okay, so with that, it's now the time for the activity. But maybe before that, are there any questions that I could potentially help with? So if there are no questions, then we can proceed with our activity. Okay. So Melissa, do feel free to let us know, if you have questions or how we can help you, because as I can see, it's a very cozy workshop, okay, where there's 4 of us. And I understand that because this recording, this session will be recorded. So for those of you who may be looking at this via the recording, again, please do feel free to drop Mavian and I an email if you have questions, because you're not able to participate. Maybe it's due to the time zone, okay, time zone differences that may not allow you to join. Okay.
I don't have a question yet, but I do have a comment that I would like to just say is that I think the fact that you actually trialed this in the research and also in the energy module, I think that speaks volumes, because it actually shows how transferable this is actually as well. Just out of curiosity, do you also feel that when students actually engage in this student-based scenario-based student-generated questions, do you think it also increases their employability skills?
Very good, very good question, and thank you for the question, Shamima. We'll elaborate more on this in the talk tomorrow. But I guess since you asked, it's a nice a point to share more on this. So when we did the focus group, we did ask the students, okay, and that is when you go into the workplace, you being the students, would you expect your reporting officers or your bosses, okay, to provide you with a big question, okay, with several options as possible solutions? Or would they give you just a big question and leave it to you to find the solution by yourself? So most of the students, they opine that it will be the latter, okay, because technically bosses, they may not have the time to say that, okay, this is a question, please choose 4, that may be the solution. It is not an MCQ type of environment when we go into the workplace. So based on that, the sensing that we got was that the ability, or at least the space or the platform that was provided to the students to generate open-ended questions does help them with this faculty that they are developing. Okay, and in that sense, it will help them with the employability as well.
Yeah, and I guess to add on to what Stephen shared, when we did the focus group discussion, the students also did mention that there are some transferable skills that they can get from the sbsgq, because there was this component where they have to present their sbsgq to their peers. So they found that was actually quite helpful in improving their presentation skills. Because they have to defend their point and they also have to showcase their work. So they found that actually helps, since it mirrors the real world, the working world, where presentation is quite a common and having this opportunity to practice, they found that it's quite helpful.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes. Thank you, Shamima, for the kind question. And I guess as a note for those who may be looking at this presentation via the recording, you notice that the slides are not in full-blown presenter view because I think we did have a dry run earlier on. Somehow it did not show. Hence, that may explain why you see words like file, home, insert, draw, and design at the top bar. Yeah. So we thought that this works best. So please pardon us for this presentation. But I think more importantly, you're able to see the slides and that the message was brought across. Yeah. Okay, so the timer shows that it's 19 minutes now. But we understand that participants may still be busy developing their questions. So shall we maybe give another 3 minutes? So that would be 15 minutes, yeah, before the when the timer hits 15 minutes. Okay. And again, like before, if there are questions, please do feel free to ask them. Yes, Shamima, thank you for the question. No worries, it's okay. Thank you.
So I have a very quick question. I really find your area of study very interesting, but I really would like to understand whether if you find there to be any barriers in applying this in your university or within your own faculty.
Okay, very good question. So maybe I'll skip the slides to this part, and that is the benefits. Yeah. So what we realize is that if you notice throughout the talk, I did not mention anything about hardware. I did not mention anything about software. And that really helps with the adoption of this method because when we talk to colleagues, or at least within our university and our department, some of the interventions that they employed, in the teaching practice requires specialized software and hardware there. And of course, we need a budget, to subscribe to all of this. But the beauty of this approach is that there's no hardware and software cost. So we envision that this would lower down the so-called barriers for adoption. But what we found, interesting when we propose this idea to our colleagues is that they have already planned their curriculum. For example, in week 1 to week 13, this is what they plan to do. And one, I guess, item that they're trying to work on is to insert this sbsgq component. And hence, earlier on in this slide over here, I did mention that one consideration to really look at is that what level of guidance do you want to provide the student? Because if you notice, in week 6 and in the recess week, there is some element of scaffolding. Do our colleagues have time, to, let's say, apportion 1 week for this? Do they not? Again, that's something that we need to work with them. Likewise, for peer learning, do they have time for in week 7 and 8 for students to teach their first draft to their peers? So to summarize, on one hand, while there is no cost associated with hardware and software, this was one, I guess, item that was surfaced when we talked to our colleagues. Generally, they were quite, motivated to employ this in their curriculum because they saw the results, and they think that this would help their students learn better. And that is why Mavian and I are working with them to see how we could potentially modify the structure a bit to incorporate this. At the bare minimum, students just need to submit the graded submission at week 9. So that's the bare minimum. So they did not have the introduction to Bloom's taxonomy. They need not have the ungraded submission. So you can remove all those the first 4 items and just have the graded submission. But of course, what that means is that the students may not fully appreciate the process. But it's a balance. It's a fine balance that lecturers will have to come to terms with. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Also, I was just wondering, were there any limitations when you were conducting this research?
Okay. Yes. One major limitation that we faced was the mode of learning. So let me explain. Yeah. If you go to this slide over here, and these 2 slides are pretty similar, so maybe I'll just use the energy management slide. So the cohort without intervention, the class was conducted in a face-to-face environment. Okay, so when we wrote the grant for this project, we envisioned for the whole project to take place in a face-to-face environment. But COVID hit us, and so the intervention cohort or the cohort with the SGQ, we were forced to move to an online environment. Okay, so I guess there is one limitation. Now, our peers will come to us and say, hey, how can you decouple this, these variables, like the results that we see? Is it because of your intervention, or is it because of the mode of learning? And that's where we go back to them and say, yes, that's a very good question. Hence, please just give us more money to conduct another study to push this further. But on a serious note, I think this is a very valid point that we are quite keen to explore as well. Yeah.
It definitely sounds like a very important area to actually explore. The benefits that students seem to be able to get out of this seems massive, actually. So that's really good. That's really great. I actually just have one more question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is that what should be the next step for this?
Okay. So the next steps, we really are looking towards expanding this to other modules. Okay, because people may say, yeah, it may work in, let's say, research methods, it may work in energy management, but does it work, let's say, in a course like pharmacy that relies heavily on recall? Does it work in a course, let's say, like a literature? So again, we want to develop an intervention that is applicable to several disciplines, but then there's that challenge because every discipline is unique. So how do we develop something that can be so-called easily accessible by the different disciplines? And that's where we need the feedback as we implement in the other disciplines. And of course, as you've rightly pointed out, one of the limitations is the comparison of the online and face-to-face effects. And then finally, and this is what we really seek to obtain in this conference, is that we are looking for international collaborators to see how this SBSGQ could be implemented in different contexts as well. So Shamima, if you're keen, we can definitely talk about collaborations with you as well.
Sure, definitely. Why not? Serious. I think you've got about 12 to 15 minutes left. Do you want to finish up your presentation?
Okay, sure. So, hopefully the time allocated for the activity has allowed participants to, understand the concept better. And because this is recorded, you can always go back in the recording to look at certain parts that you may not be familiar with, to aid you with this activity. And again, the future, what is next? Okay, we've covered some of that in the Q&A, but let me maybe expand on what was mentioned in the Q&A earlier. So as I've shared, we are looking at these three areas where we want to implement in other disciplines, compare the effects of online and face-to-face when we have the SBSGQ. Now, on this note, I'd like to add one more point, and that is, if we look at, on this point, basically the point in the middle, if we look at the results, one would expect that all things equal, the face-to-face cohort, okay, which happens to be the without SGQ, would be better because there's closer interaction and immediate clarification of misconceptions. But what was interesting was that the cohort, the online cohort that did not have the advantages of face-to-face learning performed better when SGQ was implemented. So based on this, we expect that the face-to-face cohort with SGQ would have a magnified effect because we now have face-to-face learning plus the SBSGQ. In this case, the face-to-face learning without SBSGQ perform worse than the online learning with SBSGQ. So if we add two positive so-called effects, which is the face-to-face learning and the SBSGQ, we expect a much more significant result. Okay, so on this note, that is why we are quite keen to really explore this second point over here. What are the effects when we look at online versus face-to-face with SBSGQ? Now, the third point, this is really where we would like to invite those who are present here and those who may be looking at this recording to really drop us an email. We also hope that the infographic that you can obtain via the attachment link in this session, we have our details over there as well, and we would like to reach out to fellow like-minded educators, to see how we can implement this across different contexts, because I think that will be a very powerful and impactful study that could arise from this collaboration. Okay, then finally, there's this survey form that we would like to seek your feedback on. Okay, and towards the end, one of the questions that we ask in the form is whether you would be interested, you meaning attendees who are now present in the workshop and those who are looking at this via the recorded function, okay, whether you are interested to be part of this, let's say, a special interest group exploring how we implement this in our own teaching and learning. So maybe what I'll do is I can copy this link, okay, and share that in the chat. Yeah, so that way it'll be easier for everybody. Okay, so you should see this appearing in your chat. Yeah. Okay, and with that, the benefits. Okay, why should we adopt this? Okay, there's no hardware and software cost, which again, when you talk to your department head, it's always easy to implement something when it's free in that sense. Yeah. So we envision that this would allow a widespread adoption, and that is something that we are currently working with, actually, from colleagues in civil and colleagues in psychology, okay, to see how we can implement this in their curriculum. Okay, the other benefit is that, remember, if you recall, through the mistakes, okay, that students make in their questions, these mistakes can provide nuggets of information for the lecturer to provide targeted feedback. Okay, and then finally, there's increased engagement because students are now learning actively. Now for this, let me just show this slide here. You will notice that it used to be the students are only involved in this final phase of the learning process. But because we now involve the students in all these 4 stages, they become more engaged and they take a higher ownership of their learning. So I'd like to end off with this quote, okay? Change is the end result of all true learning, and it is really our hope that through this workshop, you've gained something useful that would help you with your teaching and learning. Okay, so with that, thank you very much for coming to this workshop. And if there are any questions, please feel free to drop me an email, and we'll be happy to work with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very insightful workshop. I definitely enjoyed it. And I do know that, I know this is a very cozy workshop, but I do see that a lot of people actually signed up for your workshop. So I'm quite positive that a lot of people will actually be viewing the recordings and all. So that is really good. And thank you very much. And for everyone present here and for those watching as well, there's a private messaging system on Canopy, and you can also use that to get in touch with the speakers as well. So thank you very much. Right.
Thank you, Shamima, as well, for your kind help with the moderation. We really appreciate your help with this.
It's been my pleasure. It's actually an eye-opening topic, and I definitely, like I said, it's something that I think educators can really consider doing as well. It's a very it's my opinion that I feel that's a very targeted approach. So I think it's beneficial. So it's really good. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind words.
Right, and good luck. And with this, I will end the session.